Good evening. I want to begin this evening with a bit of an apology. I hope you received my note that I sent out this past week. I forgot to listen to what I said the first time I talked to you about this class. I said the reason that I called this class the story of the Jewish people and not a history of the Jewish people was I didn't want to burden all of you by going through a detailed history of Jewish life from the beginning till today. First of all, I could never have done it. I was discovering as I was preparing materials, there's just too much material to prepare. I couldn't prepare a decent history for you. And what's more, you didn't sign up for this course to get a history. You wanted a story. So tonight I am going back to my original intention, which is not to tell you the history of the Jewish people, but to tell you a story, the story of the Jewish people, which doesn't have a lot of detail, facts, persons, places, dates, things like that, but it will give you the essence of Jewish history. By doing this, I hope you will be more interested and more involved. And I know I'm going to have a lot less work on my hands over the next few weeks to do by turning to a story format as opposed to trying to compose a history. So for all those of you who have stayed with me for the past 3 weeks, as we're going to week number 4, I began with a history just to try and show you that the story of the Jewish people is not a complete fiction. I started on the wrong path because I wanted to emphasize to you that there is an external independent history of the Jewish people apart from the Hebrew Bible and apart from the story that we Jews have recorded about our own lives over the generations. I pursued that for the first couple of sessions. Now that I think I've hopefully convinced you that there is independent outside information that confirms the story of the Jewish people as told in the Bible, I'm going to go back to the story. As a matter of fact, with 2 weeks to go to Passover, this is probably the perfect time to do that. So what I'm going to do in my 1 hour with you today is briefly, and I mean briefly, review everything I have covered about Jewish history from the patriarchs through the enslavement of the Jewish people in Egypt, all the way through the Exodus, all the way through the entry of the Jewish people into the land of Israel and the conquest of the Canaanite tribes and the different groups that Joshua and the people of Israel had to confront. Necessarily, this is not going to be detailed, but I hope that the information that I am conveying will give you enough of a background to appreciate the story. So let's start, if I can, at the beginning. I told you that in Jewish history, according to the Bible, it begins with the patriarchs. And if I haven't already explained who the patriarchs are, they are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can encapsulate the story of the patriarchs of the Jewish people in 3 generations. Abraham gave birth to Isaac, Isaac gave birth to Jacob, and Jacob in turn gave birth to 12 sons. And so actually I said 3 generations, the patriarchs are 3, but the books of Genesis, the story of the Jewish people in Genesis, occurs over 4 generations, from the time of Abraham to the time of Joseph and his brothers and their descendants. That 4-generation period is all contained in the first book of the Hebrew Bible called the Book of Genesis. Now, I'm not going to go over history with you tonight. I'm going to go over with you the lessons that we learn from the stories that are contained in the book of Genesis and also in the beginning of the book of Exodus. If you look at the story of the patriarchs, there are certain themes, there are certain ideas that repeat themselves again and again and again. And quite apart from the history, these ideas, these themes are of very great importance. Theme number 1, the Jewish family, starting with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, going to Joseph and his brother's time, was rather dysfunctional. I say dysfunctional with respect. I do not mean anything pejorative by that. What I am telling you is if you look at these stories and you analyze the characters that are contained in the book of Genesis all the way up to its end, you will see a series of conflicts, of problems, of mistakes that are made from one generation to the next, I want to review those problems with you. To begin with, there's a lot of dysfunction in the Jewish family, and it starts with the Jewish women who are mentioned: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. I would be less than honest with you if I didn't say that Jewish women in the Bible have a lot of problems. And one of the problems is barrenness. You'll remember that the poor Sarah, who was married to Abraham for 90 years before she conceived and had a son through Abraham, Sarah was barren. If you look at the story of Rebecca in the next generation, she can't have a child, and she entreats her husband Isaac to intercede with God and pray for her. When Jacob himself goes and marries two sisters, Leah and Rachel, Leah has many, many children, gives birth to 6 sons and a daughter, but poor Rachel can't give birth to any children, and she is so desperate that she has to give her handmaid to Jacob to father children. What you see in the generations of the patriarchs is a series of women for whom conception is very important, who took God at his words. He promised it to Jewish people. He promised Abraham that he would be a father of a multitude of nations, that Abraham's seed would be like the stars in the heaven and the sand on the sea. But lo and behold, after 3 or 4 generations, there are not that many Jews around, not that many descendants of Abraham around, and it doesn't come easily. It only comes after hardship and complaint. And many of the conflicts in the early part of the Bible have to do with women who are barren and who resent other people in the story. Remember that Sarah cannot give birth to a child, so she tells her husband Abraham to take a concubine, her servant Hagar. Hagar becomes pregnant. Sarah is resentful that Hagar is pregnant and she can give Abraham what Sarah cannot. And when Sarah herself becomes pregnant with Isaac, what does she do? She tells Abraham he must turn out Hagar and he must turn out Ishmael, the wife and the concubine and the son he has from her. He must send them away because Sarah says they will not inherit with my son, with Isaac. Later on, we see that Isaac has a wife, Rebecca, but Isaac and Rebecca also have a fault. They have favorites. Isaac happens to prefer his older son, Esau, while Rachel, who knows something that Isaac doesn't, has a preference for her younger son, Jacob. Now, if they had talked with one another like parents should, if Rachel had said something to Jacob or Jacob had said something to Rachel, maybe they could have ironed it out, but they didn't. Instead, what had to happen was when Isaac was ready to give a blessing to his sons, he intended to bless his son Esau, the older boy, and Rebecca, in an effort to stop it, deceives both Isaac and the brother and Esau, and she substitutes Jacob for Esau. Again, that results in conflict in the family. Then Jacob goes and he travels to his uncle to escape from his brother, and he works for 7 years to marry a beautiful woman named Rachel. And after he works for 7 years and he's given Rachel on the wedding night, what does he discover? His father-in-law has tricked him and has substituted Leah, the older daughter, for Rachel, the younger daughter. And now poor Jacob is married to both daughters, and they're competing with each other. Leah realizes that Jacob prefers Rachel. Rachel can't have children. Leah is the one who bears 6 sons and a daughter. And poor Rachel is sitting there barren. She can't compete. There is a rivalry between the wives and the concubines, and poor Jacob lives a very difficult life because he must satisfy 2 wives, 2 concubines, two other women. And on top of that, he's got all of these children. At the end of all of these years, he has 12 sons and a daughter, and he has no peace. What happens next? Well, you know the story. Jacob, who suffered from favoritism, himself favors his youngest son, Joseph. You'll remember that of all Jacob's 12 children, the son that Jacob favors the most was the son of his deceased wife, Leah. And Jacob, very unwisely, bestows blessings and honors and favoritism upon Joseph. He presents him with a many-colored coat, and he does other things that earn Joseph the hatred of his brothers. Joseph's brothers, watching their father Jacob favor his younger son, they become so enraged that they cannot abide Jacob, and they decide they're going to kill him. They change their mind, of course, at the last moment. They decide not to kill him, to shed his blood, but they sell him down into Egypt, where he becomes a slave. And the brothers feel that they've gotten away with it, and they convince their father that that the son Joseph has been killed by a wild animal. These are dysfunctional families. Brothers hate brothers, sisters hate sisters, wives hate concubines, sisters hate each other. Everybody is competing. If you look at the stories in the first part of the book of Genesis, this is not a normal family. This is not a family where everybody loves one another and they sit around the dinner table and everybody is getting along. This is truly a group of families, 3 generations, which are dysfunctional. So dysfunctional, in fact, that you're reminded of the original story of Cain and Abel. Maybe no one kills anybody in the patriarchal family, but there's a lot of disagreement and there's a lot of hatred. So one theme that we get from the first part of the book of Genesis is the original patriarchal families were important. They were the beginning of Judaism, but they were dysfunctional. The second thing is, let us look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Each one is a pivotal person. Each one has a relationship with God and sets a pattern for Judaism, but each one is different. Let's look at Abraham. How do we describe Abraham? He's the founder. He's the originator. He's the iconoclast. He was the one who grew up in an environment of idolatry. His father Terach was in fact an idol maker. Abraham, all on his own, comes to the realization that the idols and the false gods of the people around him are not truly God. And Abraham, even before God speaks to him, has come to the realization that behind all these idolatrous images in the world, there is just one reality, one God, who is the God of all the world, and there is not a multiplicity of gods. Abraham goes to start a new way of life. He begins a new way of life. What does he do? He leaves his land, the land of Mesopotamia. He goes to the land of Israel, and he begins a new life as a stranger in the land of Canaan. And he establishes a new way of life different from everything that has gone before. Abraham is the founder, the originator of the Jewish people. What is Isaac? Isaac is continuity. He continues. Isaac doesn't do anything new or interesting. If you look at the stories of Isaac, they are repeats of the story of his father, Abraham. Isaac, in fact, repeats the story of his father, does many of the same things his father does, but Isaac represents another important element in Judaism. If Abraham is the founder, the originator of Judaism, Isaac represents continuity. Judaism cannot live if it does not have continuity. You can't be changing things in every generation. Abraham was an original. He came up with a new understanding of God. He began a new religion. He is the founder of the Jewish people. But in order for Abraham's teaching, his wisdom, his understanding to pass on to future generations, he has to depend on continuity. And his son Isaac represents continuity. What Isaac represents is he takes the teachings of his father and he makes sure he passes them on to his son, to Jacob. So if Abraham is innovation and newness and pioneering, Isaac represents continuity. He passes the tradition from Abraham to his own son, Jacob. What does Jacob represent? If Abraham is innovation and Isaac is continuity, what is the third patriarch, Jacob? And the answer is Jacob represents struggle. As a matter of fact, Jacob's name will be changed from Jacob to Israel. Why? Because he struggles throughout his life with his fellow human beings and with God, and yet he prevails. In Judaism, the patriarchs represent the 3 values that keep our people alive: innovation, breaking with the past, discovering a new truth, the oneness of God, the realization that God demands moral behavior of human beings. That's Abraham. Continuity, that generations of fathers pass on to their children, who pass on to their children, the traditions that were left from their ancestors. Isaac is continuity. And what does Jacob represent? Struggle. The Jewish people in their life will know many periods of struggle. Will they have the strength, like Jacob did, to continue on in the face of disasters, in the face of disappointments, in the face of failures? Will they have the strength to continue on? Jacob represents that strength, the struggle that doesn't end, that continues on. So those are the three first generations: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Origin, beginnings, continuity, and struggle. So that is a second theme that we have in the text. The third theme we have in the text that I want to talk about with you is the idea of unity. I told you that the biblical family was dysfunctional, and that reflects itself in the fact that there is disunity. One of the things you know about the Jewish people in history is when the world is against you, you have to stand together. If the world outside seeks to persecute you, to destroy you, seeks your harm, the only strength you have in Judaism is if all members of the people come together and stand together as one. Does the dysfunctional nature of the Jewish family finally come to a resolution? Do the Jewish people finally discover in Joseph's generation the unity that they had not realized before? And the answer is, finally, in Joseph's generation, when Joseph's brothers discover that the man before whom they are appearing in Egypt is their brother Joseph, and Joseph said, "What you did to me, you intended it for hurt, but God intended it for good. And everything that you, my brothers, have done to me, do not feel guilty about it, because you are acting as agents of God, and I forgive you." Now, I would like to say that that is the end of the story, but the brothers, you'll remember, never really feel comfortable. And when finally Jacob, at the end of the book of Genesis, dies, the brothers concoct a story. They come to Joseph and they say, "Our father, before he died, told us that you should forgive us for what we did to you." I don't know that Jacob even ever knew what the brothers did to Joseph, but the brothers, when their father Jacob dies, are so fearful that Joseph is now going to take the opportunity to exact revenge, to avenge himself on his brothers who did such terrible things to him. They invent this story. So even in the end, when they're all settled in the land of Goshen, they're living as strangers in the land of Egypt, there is still this sense of unease between the people. Are we really one people? Can we face the problems that will come upon us? And then comes the beginning of the book of Exodus. What turns the tension within the Jewish family into unity? The answer is the same thing that creates unity in Jews today: outside persecution. You want to bring Jews together because Jews, God bless them, differ on all kinds of things. They have various points of view, and they argue vociferously with one another. Two Jews, three opinions, right? The point is, if you want to create unity among a people, and by the way, Egypt represents the transition from the Jews as a family, the children of Israel, the children of Jacob, represents a transition to being a people. What does the people have in common? Shared oppression. After Joseph dies and a new Pharaoh arises who doesn't remember what Joseph did for Egypt, he persecutes the Jewish people. He begins by impressing them to do work, to build store cities of Pithom and Ramses. He makes their life hard. And when all his efforts don't succeed, he wants to limit their population. He actually enslaves them. And even when enslavement doesn't succeed, when the Jewish people turned from a nation of about 70 family members and maybe a couple of hundred household assistants, when they turn at the end of a couple of generations of a certain period of time into a nation of hundreds of thousands, Pharaoh is upset. And he decides that the Jewish people is a danger. He decides that he cannot afford to let the Jewish people live freely in the land of Egypt. And so, remembering an earlier invasion of Asians, the Hyksos invasion, Pharaoh says, we're going to have to limit the population. If slavery doesn't do it, we're going to have to destroy the Jewish people. I'll let the girls live, but he says to the midwives, if Jewish boys are born, destroy these boys on the birth stool when they're born, and we won't have to deal with this problem of Jewish overpopulation. Well, of course, the midwives don't listen to Pharaoh, and the situation becomes so dire that Pharaoh eventually says to his people in general, look, the Hebrews are too many. We haven't been able to subdue them. All the oppression, all the slavery, even the attempts I have made to try and limit their population haven't succeeded. So Pharaoh gives a general order to the Egyptian people who he says, any male child that is born to the Hebrews, throw him into the water, throw him into the Nile. And that marks the beginning of the 210 years of real slavery. Now the Jewish people are not only enslaved, they are oppressed, they are treated abominably, and Pharaoh even has designs to actually commit genocide on the people, to wipe out the Jewish people by killing all the males, leaving only the females who will be taken by the Egyptians. It looks bleak. And for 210 years, the Jewish people have no hope of survival. They hope that when the Pharaoh dies, their life will get easier. But when the Pharaoh dies, a new Pharaoh arises, and he's not going to free them either. So the people cry out to God, and God hears the Jewish people's cry. This is the story of Exodus. And God appears to Moses, and he says to Moses, I have heard the cry of my people Israel, my firstborn in Egypt. I see what the Egyptians are doing to them. And now, Moses, I appoint you to go to Pharaoh and to tell Pharaoh that Israel, this people he has enslaved, are my firstborn. And if he does not stop the oppression, if he does not let them go, if he does not let them leave Egypt, then he will suffer the consequences. Moses, of course, goes to Pharaoh. You remember the beginning of the book of Exodus. He goes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, who is this God of yours? I never heard of this God of yours. This is Egypt. I'm God. I'm Pharaoh. I'm the son of God. I don't listen to some strange Semitic God. I'm not going to let the Jewish people go. As a matter of fact, Moses, because you've interfered, I'm going to make their life even harder. So Pharaoh doesn't free the Jewish people. On the contrary, he makes their oppression even worse. So bad, in fact, that the Jewish people say to Moses, why did you come and create problems for us? Why did you intercede? Why did you go to Pharaoh and make trouble for us? Now Pharaoh has made our life harder. You haven't helped us. You haven't freed us. You've made our life more difficult. And Moses at that point says, wait and see. Now watch the deliverance which God has in store for you. And the stories in the first 12 chapters of the book of Exodus are the story of how Moses, the messenger of God, acting on God's behalf as God's prophet, as God's prophet to Pharaoh, how Moses tries to convince Pharaoh through these 10 plagues that God is more powerful than Egypt. What Moses does is, through a series of 10 miraculous events, which even the Egyptians can't emulate or repeat or respond to, Moses says, you think you're in charge? You think you're all powerful? You think the Jewish people, the people of Israel, belong to you, Pharaoh? No, God is going to show you, you're not their master. I, God, am their master. And in the end, you are going to let them go. You are going to let them leave the land of Egypt exactly as I've commanded you. Well, of course, one plague follows another over a period of about 9 or 10 months. These plagues take place. And finally, the 10th and final plague occurs. What is the 10th plague? Just as Pharaoh and the Egyptians have oppressed Israel, the people of Israel, God's firstborn son, the firstborn of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh all the way to the firstborn of the lowliest slave and the firstborn of the animals, the firstborn in Egypt, all died. On the night of the 10th plague, which we will celebrate or commemorate in another 2 weeks, a little less, on that night, God says to the Jewish people, you stay where you are. Don't even go out. Let me settle the score with the Egyptians. I, God, am dealing with them for you. You stay in your house, place blood on the doorposts of your house. Do not go out, because on that night I will send the angel of destruction to destroy the firstborn of all of Egypt, both man and beast. And sure enough, in the middle of the night at midnight, the angel of destruction goes forth. Every household in Egypt, men and animals, The firstborn dies. And at that point, Pharaoh finally calls to Moses and says, take your people and leave. Go, get out of here. And when you go and pray to your God, pray for me too. So it seems as if victory has been achieved. The Jewish people have finally been redeemed because God, who had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their ancestors, God, who had prophesied that the people would be slaves, has now heard their cry and responded to them by taking them out by miracles and wonders, taking them out from the land of Egypt. He takes them out of Egypt. They leave Egypt and they come to the Red Sea. Pharaoh has a change of heart, you'll remember. He sends his armies one more time to capture them, to subdue them, to bring them back, either kill them or make them slaves again. And God works one more great miracle at the sea. He divides the waters of the Sea of Reeds. The children of Israel pass through the water of the Sea of Reeds safely. And then as the Egyptians pursue them, God causes the waters to return in the water, and Pharaoh and his armies, his horsemen and his chariots are destroyed. The Jewish people sing. Very nice story. Very nice story. What have the Jewish people done to redeem themselves? Very little. God is the actor here. What you should realize from the book of Genesis all the way through the first 12 chapters of Exodus, the only active force here is God. The Jewish people listen to God. They're supposed to follow God, but they don't take a role in their redemption. They don't mount an insurrection and rebel against Pharaoh. They sit back and they watch the miracles that God performs, so much so that they are passive. When they're worried that Pharaoh and his armies are going to destroy them, Moses says, no, you stand, watch quietly, just witness what happens. God will take care of it. You just sit there and be witnesses. Now comes a change. Because now when the Jewish people leave Egypt, a new era enters. They are no longer in the land of slavery, the land of servitude. They are no longer bound to or committed to follow the word of another human being, Pharaoh. They are now in the wilderness. They are free, and they are commanded to observe the commandments of God. They pass from Pharaoh's possession, Pharaoh's domain, to the domain of God. Now, you would think that the Jewish people would be so exhilarated, so happy that they had left Egypt, so happy that they weren't slaves anymore, so happy that they were beginning a new life, so happy that they had witnessed 10 plagues and the division of the Red Sea. You would think they would say, great, we're going free. God freed us. Wonderful. You would think they would be grateful. No, not true at all. As we see the Jewish people during the 50 days after they leave Egypt, as they make their way to Sinai, what are the Jewish people? They're complainers. They're arguers. They throw up one objection after the other. They constantly are shown miracles, and they constantly question whether God is with them or not. You would think after the experience of the Exodus from Egypt, the Jewish people would finally get it into their heads that they are now not subject to any human, that they are now being chosen, being redeemed by God as a people chosen by him to lead a new way of life to change the world. But the Jewish people don't do that at all. They complain about food. They complain about water. They complain about this, about that. Lori, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just thinking that maybe they were overwhelmed, and they just didn't appreciate what they had or what was ahead of them. Mm-hmm. And I think they probably weren't very educated. So their thought processes are not like what we would expect them to behave.
Very good, Lori. You've made a good defense of the Jewish people. They had been slaves for 210 years. Whatever their ancestors believed, they were a people who had just gotten out of slavery. They had been told by the Egyptians exactly what to do from the moment they got up in the morning to the moment they went to sleep at night. They didn't get any rest. They worked 7 days a week. How can we expect a people who has gone through 210 years of slavery to suddenly be responsible and take responsibility for their own lives? It's not only, Lori, that they were overwhelmed, they just didn't have the capacity to suddenly become free people. You can't take people out of slavery and suddenly expect them to be free, independent people with an autonomous will. That is expecting the impossible. You can take the people out of Egypt, but you cannot take the experience of slavery in Egypt out of the people. And God realizes it. By the way, you're right, Lori. God isn't angry at the people. God says to Moses, be patient with them, bear with them. They're complaining. They're not complaining against you, God says. They're complaining to me, but I have patience because I know they're in transition. I know this generation is just recently out of slavery. I don't expect them to change. And what does God do? 50 days after they leave Egypt, complaining and making problems, God brings them to Mount Sinai. And there on Mount Sinai, God reveals himself personally to the Jewish people. Not just Moses, who goes up to the mountain to receive the revelation, but all the Jewish people now personally experience God's revelation to Moses. And when they experience this, they are so awed by it. Finally, you think they've gotten the message, they know what they're doing. You would think that finally they understand what they're supposed to do, but you discover that not only don't they necessarily understand it, but after this amazing revelation, after this experience that changes them, when they say to Moses, whatever God wants us to do, we're going to do it, Moses. We've seen it. We're the recipients of all the blessings. We've complained and whatnot, but now we see our error. We are ready to follow God, to accept his commandments, and to go into the land. Moses stays up on the mountain a while, receiving the laws from God so the people can know. What do the people do? 40 days from the moment they witnessed the revelation of God on Mount Sinai, what do the people say to Aaron when Moses fails to come back? They said, we don't know what happened to our leader. We don't know what happened to Moses. Moses was a lawgiver. Moses was the man who made us a people. Moses was the man who took us out of Egypt. Where do we go now? What do we do now? We don't know what God wants of us. God hasn't revealed anything to us personally. He's spoken through Moses. Now that Moses is gone, who's going to represent God in our midst? We need, they say to Aaron, we need a representation of God. We need a physical embodiment of God in our midst so that God can be with us. And what do they ask Aaron to build for them? They ask him to build a golden calf. Did they really think that this calf that is made out of gold is really God? No, but they believe that they need a representative, a spokesman between them and God. And having been slaves in Egypt and having been exposed for 210 years to idolatry, they believe that this God that they have created out of the gold, which they took out of Egypt, that this God will now be the intermediary, will be the spokesman, and this golden calf will reveal to them what God wants. Well, of course, the people have made a grave mistake. Moses is on top of the mountain. God says to Moses on the 40th day of Moses being up there, what have the people done? They just saw me. They just heard my revelation. They just promised to be true to me and faithful, and they have turned aside and they have made themselves an idol, which is against one of the first rules they heard. You shall not have other gods besides me. And they're worshiping it. God says to Moses, this people is hopeless. I can't do anything with them. Now, Lori, at this point, God is becoming a little frustrated, right? He says, I took them out of Egypt. Yeah, they're slaves, but after everything I've shown them, after all the miracles, after feeding them the manna every single day, after providing water for them, after having seen the revelation, you might think that this people has a clue. But no, they don't seem to have a clue. And God is so upset. He says to Moses, it's hopeless. Go down and tell the people, I'm angry. I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to make a people of you. Now, God doesn't really intend to do that. It is to test Moses. When God says to Moses, this people is hopeless. This people is not going to succeed. Let me wipe them out and begin again with you. Moses does what he's supposed to do as a leader. He intercedes with God. He pleads on behalf of the people of Israel. He said, God, if you intend to wipe them out, wipe me out with them. If they failed, then I, their leader, have failed. If you are going to give up on them and are going to destroy what you've started, then all the nations that have seen your might will think you're unable to bring this people into the land. They will think you are not faithful to the promise that you made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God, if you intend to really do this, then wipe me out too. And God is persuaded by Moses to forgive the people. Not only does God not punish the people and wipe them out, eventually Moses manages to bring the people's repentance back to God, and God finally agrees that he will continue to remain with the people of Israel in the desert after all this takes place. I'm going to pause. James, did you have a question you had? Go ahead.
Did you say God physically revealed himself in front of the Jewish people? Because I've never heard that. Is that what happened?
Yes. Physically, not in direct form or direct image, but you'll remember that the description of God's revelation on Sinai was in smoke. A thick cloud covered the mountain. God reveals himself not in any kind of a concrete physical way. No one sees God. But according to Jewish tradition, the first two commandments, James, that Moses hears, not only does Moses hear this, but the people hear it too. When God says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God, and he says, you shall have no other gods besides me. Not only does Moses hear him say this, but the people hear him say it too. The people are so shaken by the experience that they say to Moses, James, we can't bear to listen to God anymore. You go up and talk to God and let him give you the message. You come back and tell us what God wants and we'll do it. So when I say, James, that he manifested himself to the people, not in any kind of image or likeness, because God has no image, but the people were aware from the experience of Sinai that it wasn't Moses making up these laws. It wasn't Moses making up the story. It was, in fact, a real experience that they all shared, and Moses was merely the intermediary. Does that answer your question?
So did God physically speak to them? I mean, how did he communicate if he wasn't visible?
Okay. Here's what I'm going to tell you. Physically speak, I don't know. I don't know what they heard, but they, according to our scholars, our sages, the words of the first two commandments were not communicated to them through Moses as kind of the prophet or the oracle or the messenger. They heard the first two commandments directly from God. So yes, I'm telling you, James, I don't know what this heard means. Did they hear it physically? Did they know it in their mind? Maybe the only thing they realized was this manifestation of God was so apparent that they realized that God was real. He was the power and none else. I don't know how they heard it. I'm not going to begin to explain to you what heard means. I'm just telling you that the Jewish people at that instant accepted God, accepted his power, accepted his reality.
Okay. And then why did he wait 210 years to free the Jewish people if he wanted to send them to Israel through Abraham in the first place?
God deliberately wants the people to experience 210 years of slavery. When God first appears to Abraham, you can go back to the book of Genesis, I believe it's chapter 14 or something like that. God says to Abraham, he tells Abraham in advance, your descendants, your offspring will be slaves in Egypt. He actually tells Abraham, before I take them as my people, I will first bring them down to Egypt, and they will first experience what it is like to be servants or slaves to other human beings. In other words, I guess what I'm saying, James, is they had to go through the Exodus. They had to know the oppression of the 200 years in order to appreciate the Exodus that was to follow. What I guess I'm saying also is there is a concrete importance to what the Jewish people experienced in Egypt. The 200 years of being oppressed by other human beings, the 210 years of seeing how human beings can dominate and rule over and treat abysmally other human beings was necessary for their development. So at the end of 200 years, 210 years, when God finally redeems them by miracles, he has shown them the difference between God as their master and other human beings as their master. Now, I wish I could tell you the story has a happy ending at that point. God forgives the Jewish people. The Jewish people are reconciled again with God. God continues to do things. He says to the people, build me a tabernacle, build me a mishkan in your midst, so that you will always know that I dwell among you. Never think that I am abandoning you. By building this mishkan, this tabernacle, it will be a symbol that I am always with you. Even if you don't hear me directly, even if Moses speaks to you, the tabernacle is the indication that I, God, dwell in your midst. The people accept that. They give all kinds of materials to the tabernacle. In the book of Leviticus, which we're starting this week, you will see that the people have donated all kinds of wonderful things, and out of them, they build this beautiful, beautiful, wonderful tabernacle. Actually, we found it in the last part of the book of Exodus. They build this wonderful structure. God finally says to them, good, you finally got the picture. Moses has been teaching you. You finally know the lessons. I've done enough for you. I, God, have taken care of you and watched over you for a whole year and a month. Now it's your time, Jewish people, to go in and do something for yourself. I'm telling you, now is a time to go into the land of Israel. Originally, the Jewish people was not supposed to spend 40 years in the wilderness. Originally, God hoped that seeing all these miracles and being finally redeemed from the most powerful nation of the world, that the Jewish people would finally realize God is in charge, we belong to him, his law is our law, and there is no nation or no peoples or no force in the world that can defeat us. But sure enough, what happens? They are told now you have to go in, trust in me, take the land. A little over 1 year after they leave Egypt, the people rebel against God. They say, no, we're not going in. When they finally have the opportunity to win their own freedom, when God says, enough of me doing it for you, I'm not always going to be there for you. You have to have trust in me. You have to have faith in me. You must act on your own behalf. You must believe you can do it. When they come to the boundaries, the borders of the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, and the spies go in and spy out the land, and they come back and they say to the people, yes, it's a good land, the land which God has promised us. We've gone through it. It's a beautiful land. It's a land of milk and honey. It's a land of rivers and streams, and it's a wonderful, bountiful land. However, it's an occupied land, and there are a lot of people there who are stronger than us. So they say to the Jewish people, or they convince the Jewish people, it's hopeless. The Jewish people hear the report of the spies and they say, we can't do it. Why did you bring us out of slavery, Moses? If we were going to die at the hands of our enemies, why didn't you just leave us as slaves in Egypt? What possible reason could you have for causing us to go in and fight and die? Not only will we die, but our wives and our children will be taken captives by the people whose land we are going to enter. And what do the people do? A rebellion is so serious, and the people propose to go back to Egypt. They want to appoint a new leader. Moses, you're not our leader anymore. We're going to appoint someone else. We're going to go back to Egypt and try it back there again. God becomes so angry with the Jewish people that he finally says, enough. It's done. Enough. He says to Moses, I'm not going to wipe them out, but this people, these slaves who came out of Egypt, who've been out of Egypt for about 13, 14 months, they are not worthy of going and conquering the land. This people doesn't have the strength, the conviction, the belief. They don't have the inner certitude and fortitude to be able to do what has to be done. I'm not taking them anywhere. They said they were going to die. They're right. I'm going to wait for that whole generation that came out of Egypt to die in the wilderness. They're going to die. The people, of course, when they hear this, when they realize that they have shown no faith in God, that they have distrusted Moses, that despite everything they promised to God and all their supposed faithfulness, whatever God says will do, they realize that it was a shallow promise. When they had the chance to trust in God and go into the land a year and a month or so after they left, a year and a half after they left, less than that, they say, no, we can't do it. And they are punished, and God says, you will therefore wander until all of you who were 20 years old when you left Egypt die out. The people are dismayed. Oh my God, what did we do? But it's too late. They've lost the promise of going into the land. And so the next 40 years, Moses and the Jewish people wander through the Sinai desert until that entire generation of Jews who had been 20 years or older at the time of the Exodus, that generation dies out, And those that were younger, their children who were born in the wilderness, the children who they thought were going to become captives, these children will now take the lead and they will be the ones to enter the land of Israel. That brings me up to today's lesson, okay? I've gone through everything all at once. All right. What happens at the end of 40 years after wandering? God finally said to Moses, the time has come. The people is ready to go in. The new generation, the generation born in the freedom of the desert, they will heed me. They will unite. They will do what they have to do to take possession of the land. He says to Moses, Moses, you're not going to be there. Guess what? They're going to go in, but you're going to die. Your sister Miriam died. Your brother Aaron died. You're going to die. The only one of that generation who's going in is Joshua. Joshua will go in. He will go in and lead the people for the conquest of the land, but you, Moses, will not go in. I will permit you to go to the top of the mountain across the Jordan. I will permit you to see the land which I have given to your people, the children of Israel. You can see it from afar, but you, alas, will not go in with them. You will die beyond the river, and not only will you die, but I will myself will take care of your burial. Nobody will ever know where you were buried. There may be a grave for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There may be a site for Joseph, but Moses, no one is going to know where you are buried. Why? Because of all the prophets that I have, you are the one who would be most in danger of being turned into a god. I don't want you to be a god, Moses. You were a man, a good man, a faithful man, a man who delivered my message and followed me for 40 years and led a very recalcitrant and difficult people. But now your time has come to end. Your part of the journey, your part of the story is over. You will die. Joshua will lead them. And that's what we see in this next historic episode. Moses, in fact, at the very end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses dies. At the end of the Torah, not just one book, all 5 books, we have gone through all the history of the Jewish people from Abraham all the way to the time the Jewish people are ready to enter the land of Israel. Moses will not go with them. Moses dies, but after they mourned for Moses for a period of time, Joshua now tells them the time has come. God has commanded us to go in and take possession of the land of Israel.
Rabbi?
Yes, go ahead, Larry.
Well, wasn't there an incident with Moses that caused God to say, Moses, you cannot go into the land?
There was, Larry, an incident which we are told is the reason, or the Bible suggests that one of the reasons that Moses cannot go into the land was in speaking to the people, he loses faith with them and he harangues them. And God says, because you did not have patience, neither you nor your brother Aaron will go into the land. You are correct. But I would prefer to say, Larry, that Moses and Aaron had fulfilled their function. It may be that they made some mistakes, but the point is that by the time of the end of the 40 years, Moses and Aaron were not the ones to lead them anymore. They needed.
Wasn't there a situation where about a rock?
Yeah, he was told to speak to a rock before the people and it would bring forth water. And instead of speaking to it, he chastises the people. He calls them rebels. He questions whether they've learned anything over the 40 years and he strikes the rock. And God says, no, no, no. I didn't tell you to strike the rock. I told you to speak to the rock. I didn't tell you to chastise these people. This is not the people from 40 years ago. This is the new generation. Moses, you have gone too far. You have lost the patience. You have lost the ability to be an effective leader. You must now give up the role and it must go to Joshua. So you're right, Larry. Moses loses the right to go over. Joshua now will continue on. Joshua, who has faithfully served Moses all through the 40 years of the wandering in the wilderness, ever since Mount Sinai, Joshua now leads a united Jewish people to conquer the land of Canaan. And when I say united, even though the Jewish people are 12 tribes, meaning they are 12 separate tribes, if you read the book of Joshua, those of you who studied the book of Joshua know that in the beginning of the conquest, they function as a united people. Joshua doesn't lead 12 tribes over the Jordan. Joshua leads a united people together over the Jordan, and they meet a number of different enemies, and they are successful against them. The first wars that are spoken of in the book of Joshua are wars in which the Jewish people, not acting separately tribe by tribe or region by region, but the Jewish people collectively enter the land of Canaan, and together they defeat the armies that rise up against them. Okay, they will divide again, but for the moment, when they go in, they collectively go in and they manage to defeat their enemies. James, you had your question.
Yeah, if the Jews knew they weren't going to be allowed into Israel for 40 years, why didn't they just build their own city? Why would they wander around for 40 years?
Because God told them they couldn't go into the land. The generation would have to die out in the wilderness. There weren't any good choices, James. They weren't going back to Egypt. That was one choice. God says, I'm not letting you go into Israel, so you can't go into Israel. So you're going to stay in the Sinai desert for 40 years. Now, they could have decided to try and build in the midst of this wilderness their own civilization, but they were told it's not going to work. You are going into the land of Israel. You could have gone already, but because you rebelled against me and you refused to go up and take the land when I told you, now you are going to wander the Sinai for 40 years and you will die there. The Jewish people, James, had no choice. They tried to rebel against God. They tried to go into the land against God's command and conquer it, but they were soundly defeated by the people of the land. So when they tried to actually take the land themselves without God's help, they were defeated. Any question?
That's ironic because
Yeah, it is ironic that the very thing that they were given the opportunity to do and they did not do becomes now something they cannot do.
Yeah.
Now, here is the real interesting part. Joshua and the tribes of Israel, the sons of them, finally unified after 210 years of slavery, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, after the generation of the slaves dies out. The people are finally united. They believe in God. They believe that God is with them. They finally have the strength and the conviction to go into the land and fight themselves. Even though God, they believe, is with them, they fight the battles themselves and they win. Jericho, the first city they come across, is miraculously destroyed, not just by the armies of Israel, but by a miraculous earthquake, which topples the entire city. The people of Israel, the Jewish people, meet groups of enemies and they defeat one after the other in these miraculous battles. And by the end of the book of Joshua, it looks like everything is done. It looks like the Jewish people have taken the land of Canaan, and now comes the part where God gets to say, someone gets to say, and they lived happily ever after. But that is not what happened. No sooner did the Jewish people meet their enemies, defeat them, and manage to begin to spread out and to settle in the land, then they immediately became divided again. They split into tribes and regions. They lost their unity, and after Joshua died, there was no ruler who replaced Joshua. Instead, each tribe, who now had their own territory, went their own way. Each tribe was given a piece of land, and each tribe said, we'll do it for ourselves, we'll fight for ourselves now. Did the tribes come together afterward and fight it together? Sometimes, but most of the times they only looked after themselves. This period after Joshua, which we will look at next week, was called the period of the judges. Who were the judges? They were not judges like you think of them. They were tribal leaders. They were strong men in each tribe who came around at a critical time and saved their tribe or their group of tribes from enemies who sought to destroy them. But they were divided. The Jewish people were not unified and whole. And the very thing that God had warned the Jewish people about, they fell into that trap. God says, when you go into the land and you inherit these cities and you inherit this land of blessing, beware lest you think that it was your might and your power and your virtue which won this for you. This land was given to you, God says, by me. Never forget that it wasn't you who secured the land, who conquered the land, who subdued the land. It was me. You must follow my word. The Jewish people come into the land, and no sooner do they divide into their different districts and territories, they begin to follow the Canaanite practices, the practices of the people of the land. They are not even faithful to God. They suddenly start to mix with the people of the land, and they are going astray, which is why, according to the book of Judges, God allows various peoples to come and overpower them. Why? Because the Jewish people, once they have conquered the land under Joshua, once they have driven out the major armies, they lapse. They fail to follow God's word, and God allows the local population, the local enemies, to disturb them, to cause them grief, to win back territory so that they are continually fighting to maintain what they have. The Jewish people did not learn the lesson, or they did learn the lesson. After a period of time, I don't know how much time, 80, 100 years, after trying to live as 12 independent tribes, they say, we can't do it anymore. We need to unify together as a nation. We, the Jewish people, have to be united. We have to be one, like in the time of the wilderness under Moses, like in the time of the conquest of the land under Joshua. We cannot be separate tribes, each doing our own thing. We must be one nation, and there must be one ruler over us, not these temporary strongmen, these judges. We need a king, which will mark now the period that we go into next. So Israel, even after they enter the land, even after they have been successful, even after God has done what he said, and they initially conquer these major cities and territories, Israel, no sooner do they start to settle in the land than once again they relapse. They're divided again. They forget the commitment that God had demanded of them. They go astray after the peoples and the gods of the land in which they settled. And they have these periodic conflicts in the time of the judges, which remind them that they are not secure. And finally, they face an enemy who is more powerful than any individual tribe. They face the Philistines, the people that we will meet next week, the people who are the ancestors, if you will, or the namesakes of the Palestinians of today. The Philistines decide they are going to once and for all take care of Israel. They are going to wipe Israel out. The tribes feel they cannot face the Philistines alone. They need to be united. They say to the prophet Samuel, we need a king. Samuel, you must give us a king. And now will come the period of kingship when Samuel, and we'll talk about this next week, will first anoint Saul, Shaul, and then David, and finally he will turn to Shlomo, Solomon. And in those 3 generations, that period of time, the disunified tribes of Israel, again, disunified like the brothers were, will come together under a king, and they will establish the national life of the Jewish people. And that, in 58 minutes, is the story of everything from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through the story of Joseph and slavery in Egypt, through the exodus from Egypt, the 40 years of wandering in order to get rid of the slave generation, the founding of a new generation who, under Joshua, goes in, conquers the land. It looks like it's going to be happily ever after, but whenever you think that the Jewish people have learned their lesson and now they're going to walk the straight and narrow, something happens to spoil it. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. All right, Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing. I think in one of our discussions that you and I have had in the past, I think you may explain to me that God realized that the Jewish people needed somebody physical to look to, that God wasn't that person. Though he can lead them, they needed somebody physical. And that's how the kings came about.
Yes, and God was disappointed, Larry, in that. He wasn't happy about it. He says to Samuel, the people ask for a king, they need a representative. I'm their representative. They should have trusted in me. I'm their God. I led them. I helped them conquer the land, but they feel they need to trust the physical representation. Fine, Samuel, listen to them. They're not rejecting you as a prophet. They're rejecting, God says, me. They're not satisfied with God as their king. They want a human king. Okay, if that's what they want, someone who will go before them out to battle and bring them back from battle safely, go ahead. If that's what they think will make them happy, appoint for them a king. It turns out, Larry, it's a disaster. It does not make them happy at all. Anybody else? Completely open. Yes, go ahead, James.
Really quick, with the 12 tribes that they divided into once they got to Israel, the same 12 tribes as under Israel or Jacob?
They became 12 tribes again. The tribes that had been molded together, James, during the 40 years of the wilderness, the 40 years made those 12 tribes one people. When Joshua takes them in to conquer the land, they are, James, one people. But no sooner do they enter the land, and then Joshua makes, well, he does what God told him to. He appoints to each tribe an area to inhabit. He gives Judah an area. He gives Reuben an area. He gives Shimon an area. He gives each of the tribes an area. No sooner do the tribes inhabit, James, their individual areas than they break out again into factionalism.
Okay, so
The
it's the same
unity that
process.
the unity that they had achieved in the wilderness, the unity they had achieved in the conquest, that unity suddenly disappears and they now become fractured. Here's his lesson. When the Jewish people are strong and stand together with no factions between them, we can face anything. We can meet any challenge. But when we disagree amongst ourselves, when we fight amongst ourselves, as sadly we still do today, if the Jewish people are not unified, then their enemies have the power, have the ability to subdue them, to win over them. God has told Israel, if you are together, if you trust in me, if you do not fight with one another, if you remain one people, you will succeed. But if you divide yourself up, if you fall out in factions among yourselves, then you will know disaster. And as we're going to see in the next couple of lectures, disaster will come. As much as I want to tell you that the history is a happy history, that the Jewish people enter the land and they have prosperity, the Jewish people only live in the land for about 300 years before the land starts being conquered. Their own divisions cause this ruin. Go ahead, James.
You said Ishmael or the Philistines were were turned into the Palestinians. So does that mean that they're ancestors of Ishmael?
Okay, they didn't turn into Palestinians. When the Romans, many generations later, will come to the Romans, when the Romans finally destroy the independent kingdom of Judea, they want to heap insult upon injury. They not only destroy the independent kingdom of Judea, they say, we're going to give it a new name now. What people was the people that the Jewish people battled the most, they hated the most, they fought with the most? Those were the Philistines. So the Romans said, we're now going to call what was called Judea, we're going to call it Palestina, which is the Roman word for Palestine. So Palestina, the name of the ancient enemy of the Jewish people, becomes the name that the Romans give the land of Judea after the conquest.
Nice. Okay.
Okay. All right. That's a lot of information today, but I promise you that I had to go back through to repeat, but now it will be very straightforward. There will be more time to talk. I will not burden you with facts and figures, except to tell you that everything I am telling you now, if I wanted to, which I don't, can be verified by actual facts, okay? Trust me, I'm not going to give you dates and times and whatnot. I will send you notes to give you time frames, but I'm not going to burden you with that. I am telling you a story. I have now told you this biblical story of Israel, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, through their generations, through Joseph, through their enslavement, through their exodus from Egypt, through their conquest of the land. I have taken you all the way through the Bible. Now I'm going to, through the Torah. Now I'm going to take you through the historic books. I'm going to take you through Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. We are now going to enter the historical period. I won't bother you with facts, but everything I'm telling you can be substantiated. All right? Anybody else? Yes, go ahead, Joseph.
So outside of the Bible, is there historical record for King David?
Yes, yes. Starting with last week when I told you the Merneptah Stela, starting with the time of the Exodus, about 1250 BCE, there is external evidence for the Jewish people. Like, you don't have to rely on the Bible anymore. Up until a certain point, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you have to rely on the Bible. There's no external history. The settlement of the Jews in Egypt, there was some evidence for that, but there's no external history. But starting with the Exodus, Joseph, there is external history. Everything I am telling you is not only comes from the Hebrew Bible, the books of Joshua and on, it comes from external sources as well. Laura, you had your hand up.
Oh, I just want to say thank you for providing the clarity, because that really helped me figure out the timeline of how things were.
I will send you a timeline, Lori. I created the confusion. I felt compelled to, I'm only making up for what I
Notice the
did to you. I
confusion.
confused you with all of these facts and figures. I will send you out a very concise outline of everything from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all the way to the entry of the Jewish people in Israel. You will have that. And now we don't go back anymore. Now we go on to the history of the Jewish people in their land.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was very straightforward. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here tonight, and I'll see you next week. God
See you
willing.
next week. Oh, wait, are we gonna break for Passover?
No, we are not. I will tell you about that next week. We go straight now. No breaks, no breaks.
Okay,
Because
Thank you.
Passover occurs on Saturday night, Sunday, by the time of Monday, we'll already be through with the Seder's. We're going straight through
okay,
now.
we're good.
Okay,
Okay.
good
Night,
night.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Night,
Thank you so
night.
much.
Okay, I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, yes.